think we will go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time this afternoon to join us in our panel discussion on schooling in the era of COVID-19. My name is Erica Breunin, and I'm an education reporter with the Colorado Sun. We're here today for a conversation that has been organized by A+ Colorado and Education Reform Now. Over the next hour, that conversation will unfold with a group of education leaders. These leaders have been facing many of the same uncertainties and challenges almost all of us have during this time of the coronavirus pandemic, only at a much greater scale. They've had to make quick decisions in the interest of thousands of students, and while their districts have been transitioning to remote learning, they've also been stepping up to make sure their families have access to technology and enough food. In my reporting, superintendents have stressed to me that as important as academics are, staying connected with families and making sure their basic needs are met is critical right now. And we're seeing districts across Colorado step up and take those responsibilities upon themselves. Much of today's conversation will be framed around the supports needed for vulnerable populations of students across Colorado and across the country. Those students include students who qualify for free and reduced price lunch, students with special needs, and emerging multilingual students. I'll kick our panel off with a Q&A with all of our members, and afterwards we'll open up our conversation to questions from audience members. If you yourself have a question you'd like to submit, please click on the Q&A icon and you can type your question right there. Before we get going, I'm going to run through some quick introductions of our panelists and of myself. Again, my name is Erica Breunin and I cover education for the Colorado Sun. We're a digital news outlet based in Denver, and we're owned by journalists and supported by readers. Our mission is a simple one, but our coverage is broad. We pursue stories that are thoughtful, in depth, and that cover the issues affecting the daily lives of Coloradans. And without our coverage, many of those issues would go unreported. Joining me today is Susana Cordova, Superintendent of Denver Public Schools, which has about 92,000 students. Superintendent Cordova, a graduate of DPS herself, has spent her life in Denver. Before becoming DPS's top administrator, she devoted more than 20 years of teaching and working as a school administrator in elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools in the district. We also have Dr. John King, former U.S. Education Secretary and current president and CEO of Education Trust, a nonprofit focused on pinpointing and closing achievement gaps across grades. Dr. King was the 10th U.S. Secretary of Education under President Barack Obama, and he previously served as the U.S. Deputy Secretary of Education, along with having served as the first African American and Puerto Rican in the role of New York State Education Commissioner. Dr. King's career in education has also included school leadership positions, including the job of managing director with Uncommon Schools, which is a nonprofit charter management organization overseeing public schools in New York, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. He also served as co-founder and co-director for curriculum and instruction of Roxbury Preparatory Charter School in Massachusetts. Dr. King stepped into education as a high school social studies teacher in Puerto Rico and in Boston, and he also served as a middle school principal. We also have with us today Michelle Murphy, who is Executive Director of Colorado Rural Alliance. Michelle has been the Executive Director of the Alliance since 2015. Her career has also included working as advocacy and legal counsel for the Colorado Association of School Boards and working in schools facilitating crisis intervention support. Michelle has been focused on school policy for about the past 20 years, as well as school law. The Alliance brings together 146 rural school districts in Colorado who work together with community residents to try and expand opportunities for Colorado's rural students and rural areas. And rounding out our panel today is Rob Stein, Superintendent of Roaring Fork Schools, a district of about 6,000 students. Superintendent Stein has more than 30 years of experience in education reform through the lens of a school teacher, a school leader, and a consultant. He has been with Roaring Fork Schools since 2013. Within his career in education, he steered a turnaround at Manual High School. He has also taught classes focused on educational leadership and school reform at the University of Colorado, Denver University, and Harvard Graduate School of Education. With that, I would like to dive right into questions. And to begin, I'd really like to talk to our superintendents here on the panel today. I'm curious how you are currently serving Colorado's vulnerable populations of students, what that looks like in a metro district like DPS, and what that looks like in a rural district like Roaring Fork Schools. Would you like to start, Superintendent Cordova?
Sure, and thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today. And I think the frame that you've laid out is really critical frame that we have. We care so deeply about our students, both their academic needs, but also some of their basic needs. We've really stressed the importance of first making sure that we continued serving all of our students meals. If we were in school, we generally have, of our 92,000 students, about 40,000 of them who eat on a daily basis, breakfast and lunch with us. We've very quickly been able to stand up food distribution sites where we give out breakfast and lunch to any children and any adults, actually, who come by to get food. But we're still serving on a daily basis. I think we're now up to about 12,000 meals a day. So nowhere close to what we normally serve. That's an area we want to continue to focus on because we know kids can't learn if their basic needs aren't being met. So that's one of the most important things. And then today we're in day 7 of remote learning, and so we're pretty early in our work with remote learning. And for our most vulnerable populations, what that has looked like is just a Herculean effort to get out laptops to students. We've passed out 40,000 laptops to our kids. We're still not quite at the place where every student who needs one has one. We have a shipment coming in at the beginning of next week, so we'll be able to get out the last set of laptops. But probably even more challenging is getting all kids connected to the internet, and that's something that I hope we're able to spend some more time talking about today on this panel, is the importance of universal access to broadband technology. So that really is where we've been focusing, is getting some basic needs met and really just making those critical, important connections to stay in touch with our students with a focus on quality learning.
Excellent. Thank you, Superintendent Cordova. Let's turn to you, Superintendent Stein. How exactly are you serving vulnerable students in Roaring Fork schools? What does that look like for a rural district in Colorado?
Well, I think we're following a very similar path as Susana just described for Denver. We immediately launched not with distance learning, but with connection. We wanted to start by making personal connection to all of our students and families. And so every student got a personal phone call or outreach over the internet via a teacher, and every family got a phone call from either a mental health provider, a family resource liaison, or an administrator, so that we could first ascertain needs. And over the course of the couple weeks it took us to do that, we learned that, of course, this crisis is exacerbating the inequities that we've already been seeing, so that there are the people who were already most vulnerable were even more vulnerable, and there are even more families who are vulnerable. And Susana outlined the first basic needs were food. We're also hearing a lot about housing concerns, access to healthcare, access to mental health services. And our outreach calls 15 to 20% of our families were referred to mental health services. And our population is very much like Denver, where just under half of our students participate in the free lunch program. We started mapping out high densities of low income student populations, and then using bus routes to concentrate deliveries in those areas. So the meals prepared in kitchens and then delivered to those sites for pickup. And we made a pretty massive effort to let everybody know that they could come and get meals. You don't have to qualify for free lunch. Just any kid who wants a meal can come get them. And our meal distributions are daily with two meals per package. What we're seeing now that we've been at it for a couple of weeks is about 1,000 meals per day. And remember, we have a student population, about 1,000 deliveries per day, so about 2,000 meals. And that's of our 6,000 students. So a large number are really depending on our school districts for food subsidies. Another thing we learned is actually that the digital divide is not all that big, that only 319 of our 6,000 students did not have access to internet, in part because there's been a lot of effort done by Comcast and by all the wireless providers to increase access to families and students. So we got a group of community volunteers working on those 319 students, and they're literally going door to door to help them hook up with one of the available options. So we think we'll be down to 2 or 3% of our students who don't have internet access. Of course, those are the most vulnerable 2 to 3% of our students, and they're going to be further and further behind when this is all said and done. I'll pause there, and I'm sure that people have follow-up questions.
Great, thank you. Clearly a lot of moving parts with both trying to serve students academically, along with providing meals, and also the additional component of technology here. I'd like to zero in a little bit on the population of English language learners across Colorado. And I'm curious how school districts are working to serve them right now in this era of remote learning. What works to help students who are ELL in a setting of remote learning, and what really is challenging and really impossible in that kind of setting? Michelle, can you speak to that and what you're seeing in rural school districts?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, Superintendent Stein represents one of our larger rural school districts that I think upwards of 5,000 kids. And we've got, so how you and Denver and how you're handling it on the large scale is just remarkable to us. We've got over 100 districts with less than 1,000 students. And I think that they're more nimble in a lot of regards because they have smaller populations to access. Some of the things that we've heard folks are doing, they've got a fair number of paraprofessionals and others who aren't otherwise engaged in the one-to-one, you know, the remote learning process. And so they are even reassigning, not necessarily ELL paraprofessionals, to engage with their English language learners to provide that one-to-one support that they need. And that's the biggest piece we've seen, is really re-engaging and retraining staff so that they can do that one-to-one outreach that's necessary for those populations.
Great, thank you, Michelle. It's good to hear that there's still a lot of one-on-one interaction and customization between teachers and students. What about you, Superintendent Cordova? What exactly is happening in DPS schools to serve your population of English language learners in a remote setting?
Sure. So I want to give a big shout out to our teachers who are just doing remarkable work. We're definitely finding that while there is more access than maybe we would have thought, the populations that are least likely to have access to the internet are our English learner populations. Comcast has done a phenomenal job, but there's a lot of fear in our community, and I think that we've got undocumented families who are afraid to sign up for Internet Essentials, for example, because they're afraid to give their personal information despite some assurances that nothing will happen with that. And so that's really challenging. And so that's one of the places where I think we've had some real struggles. In Denver, a lot of our students are actually supported by teachers through native language instruction. And so it's been really helpful to have the number of staff members who actually speak our students' home language. And so they're able to connect with parents. They're able to connect directly with students in their home language to support them with their learning. We have lots of supports and guidance around how to support through remote learning around English language development, with a real focus on making sure that our students do still get quality English language development time. And so using Google Classroom, using Google Meets, using tools like Seesaw with our younger students, where students and teachers can actually see each other and interact, has been really, really powerful for our students. But I will say that I think it was maybe John who said it earlier on this panel. I think we're going to see many children who experience a real slide, and some of our most vulnerable populations, like our English learners, I'm really worried about, and really want to make sure that we're thinking thoughtfully about how future stimulus funding packages can address some of the needs that we know our students are going to present with after this time of remote learning.
I would just jump in and say that that's like a great source of stress for our leaders around the state about pending budget cuts and what that looks like, and how we're going to provide summer supports and additional ongoing supports in light of that we know these kids are going to need.
And that gives me a great segue. I'd like to turn now and talk about the economic relief efforts happening at the federal level. I'm curious, what components of the CARES Act do you believe are most important in the support of our most vulnerable students? And I'd like to hear from you first, Dr. King.
Sure. Well, first, thanks for the opportunity to join this conversation. In many ways, the most important elements of the CARES Act are the ones that aren't directly connected to education. We know that our most vulnerable kids and families need emergency economic support. And so the investment in unemployment insurance, in immediate financial relief for families, rescue plan for small businesses, the investment in healthcare, in our healthcare infrastructure, all of that is crucial for the kids and families that are most vulnerable. That said, there are about $30.75 billion in the third stimulus bill that were specifically focused on education, split about evenly between K through 12 and higher education. There were some separate funding streams for early childhood education. In the half of that 30.75 that was focused on K-12, 13.5 billion is going out to states that will then go to districts to try to address immediate needs, whether that's deep cleaning of school buildings, technology equipment, hotspots, professional development for teachers on doing distance learning, tools for distance learning, mental health services, immediate needs. There's another $3 billion out of that 30.75 billion that will go to governors, that governors can allocate between K-12 and higher ed to address immediate needs. The challenge that we're seeing around the country is that folks are feeling a lot of financial pressure and worried about cuts in state budgets. And so one of our fears is that much of that $13.5 billion will be used to address backfilling of lost state revenue rather than addressing immediate needs. For us, that means we are advocating that in a potential stimulus 4, we need a much bigger investment in K-12 education. If you think about the 2009 stimulus, education was about 115 billion out of roughly 780 billion. So you can see in this bill, it was 30.75 billion out of 2.2 trillion. So this was a much smaller investment in education and not nearly enough to address the needs. As states start to see the revenue decline as a result of the COVID-19 financial crisis, we are expecting that states will impose cuts on education. That will be passed along to school districts, and the school districts that have the least capacity to raise dollars locally will be the ones who suffer the most from those cuts. So we need significant additional federal investment.
Thank you, Dr. King. Dovetailing off that, given the broad discretion in the governor's fund included in the package, which is an estimated $39 million for Colorado, what would you highlight as the best leverage points for supporting our vulnerable populations of students that advocates should really consider? Can we start with you, Superintendent Cordova?
Sure. So definitely, I think thinking about how we can include in a couple of places, like at the federal level, really thinking about changes to E-rate so that we can think about how we would be able to offer more access to broadband technology. I think it's going to be a really important place to put some effort. You know, in Denver, we're really concerned about our ability to maintain even just a go-forward flat funded approach to where we are. And so thinking about the kind of investments in continued work with keeping the number of teachers that we have so that we're not in a place where we're doing furloughs. But then to go further, you know, we've had a lot of conversation about compensatory education for students with IEPs, really, really important, and we're going to need additional funding to be able to do that. But I'm equally concerned about compensatory services for students who were behind before this started and weren't on an IEP. So our students who are struggling to read at grade level, or high school students who are off track. This is incredibly important and valuable time. And while our teachers are doing phenomenal work to try to support all of their students, this is not like regular school. And I'm not confident that we're going to make the kind of progress that our students deserve. And so I think we need additional funding for things like more tutoring, summer programming. You know, I get a lot of questions about whether we're going to be offering summer school. Well, first, I don't know if we're going to be able to be together. But second of all, I don't even have the funding to be able to offer the kind of summer programming that I think our students deserve unless there's an additional investment in schools through future stimulus packages.
Thank you very much, Superintendent Cordova. How would you respond, Michelle? How do you think this $39 million would best be spent? What are the best leverage points for serving students that advocates should highlight?
Well, it's so interesting to me that schools like DPS and rural schools, in your article last week, I think it was, really highlights the similarities despite the huge discrepancy in so many ways. This pandemic has really spotlighted the broadband issues in our rural communities. When we talk about equity of access for our rural students is sort of one of our biggest, or equity of opportunity and access is the biggest issue for rural kids. And so we would hope, and we have heard that there will be additional stimulus dollars for rural broadband in rounds 2 or 3 or 4. So we certainly would support that. I say rural broadband as I look at you, Susana, I'm not sure that it's limited to rural. Other pieces of that I don't think we can ignore in light of our big state cuts. And I would say we are hearing from our JVC staff and also the department that this money cannot be used to backfill state budget cuts, that the stimulus dollars, so it's interesting to hear that concern coming from DC. Maybe that's not true, or maybe we're told there's sort of a maintenance of effort language in the stimulus package. So we're concerned that we can't use it to backfill. And probably one of the biggest hits will be behavioral health supports for our kids. In rural districts, we are short counselors and other supports currently anyway, and we know that kids are going to come back with increased needs, more kids and increased needs, both academic and emotional, and how being able to use and have additional supports around that would be a huge piece.
Thank you, Michelle. Can you elaborate on that, Dr. King? From your understanding, could these federal dollars be used to backfill school districts?
It depends on the context of the state and what the state needs to do to meet that maintenance of effort requirement. So there are some states that already, because of recent increases in spending on schools, will already have met the maintenance of effort requirement. And so those states are planning, unfortunately, to use these dollars largely to backfill against the lost revenue to the state, particularly in states where they are already seeing those revenue losses and making adjustments to current year spending. So it's really a question of the technical application of the maintenance of effort requirement, depending on the specific state's budget context.
Wonder if I could throw a follow-up question at John, maybe. Understanding the impulse to backfill, because we're all anticipating budget cuts and we've got to meet payroll and we've got to, provide programming. Do you also there? I think in the Relief Act in 2009, we learned that a lot of that funding was not very flexible, and so it wasn't leveraged very effectively. So maybe my question is, how do you think the federal government might provide enough flexibility while also some accountability that it not just be squandered on low leverage efforts?
The good news potentially here is that the dollars are quite flexible. The allowable uses are very broad in the stimulus 3 package. The allowable uses are very broad, and there's a lot of flexibility at the state and district level to decide how the dollars will be used. Same for governors. I think the challenge in that flexibility is, will folks use those dollars for the highest leverage possible investments? And I think there is a real fear that dollars may be used to purchase technology that is not good, to purchase online curricula that are not carefully vetted. And so our message to advocates at the state level has been, we really need to be vigilant in watching how those dollars are used. We need transparent reporting from states about where the dollars are put, partly so we can continue to make the case at the federal level that we need more stimulus dollars.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, I'd like to transition our conversation to looking at students who are on the cusp of post-secondary education. Colleges and universities across the state are seeing declines in the number of students paying deposits for fall enrollment. Given the fact that we already experience a certain amount of summer melt, also known as students who don't attend college even though they've been accepted, particularly among our most vulnerable students, what can K-12 systems be doing now to support seniors in taking that next step toward their post-secondary venture? Do you want to start, Dr. King?
Yeah, so a few things are critical. One, we're already seeing around the country a drop-off in FAFSA completion, which is the federal application for student aid. So we've got to make sure that students complete the FAFSA. It's the way in which they can access not only Pell Grants, but other types of financial aid at both the federal and state level. So we've got to make sure that that happens. And districts can get information on every student and whether or not they've completed the FAFSA. And high schools should be tracking down students, providing support to their families to make sure that they get the FAFSA done. Two, we do worry a lot about summer melt. There's increased risk given that students are away from school, that students will become disconnected. It's why Rob's point about school districts reaching out to every kid and connecting with every kid and family is so critical. So we need, whether it's teachers or counselors, we need them to connect with every kid, talk about their plans for September if they're a graduating senior, talk with juniors and sophomores and freshmen about their plans for next year. I'm worried about the risk that we'll see an increase in dropouts as a result of students feeling disconnected from school. So that relational piece, talking about post-secondary planning, is critical. We need higher ed to step up. Community colleges and regional publics in particular, who tend to enroll larger numbers of low-income students and first-generation students, they need to increase the frequency with which they're communicating with students and families. And hopefully some of those stimulus dollars on the higher ed side will be used for bridge programs, because I think there is increased risk that students will show up as freshmen. They won't have had in-class instruction since February, and they'll be assigned to remedial courses for which they will pay, but won't get them any closer to graduation. And so bridge programs, whether it's over the summer or co-requisite classes that blend remediation with on track to earn credits coursework, those are going to be critical to making sure that students not only get to college, but ultimately get through college.
Thank you very much. I'd like to go, oh, go ahead.
Just one thing to that our kids are under enormous economic pressure that's going to be dissuading a lot of them from going to college in the fall. What we've heard from a lot of our older students is that they need to work right now because they're the sole income earners in their families. They might be working at Walmart or Wendy's. Their parents who are in the resort industry, in the service industry for the resorts, or in construction have been laid off. And so I'm really concerned. It's not just what we can do to support them through the summer, but our economy right now is putting pressure on those families to keep their students at home working.
So knowing how high the stakes are for so many of these students, Superintendent Stein, what role does your district then play in helping trying to coach these students and usher them into post-secondary education?
Yeah, I think John already said it. We have to stay in touch with them and do our best. We have to recognize too that we're a cog in a larger machine, and you know, we're going to have to work as a society, not just as a school district, to address these issues.
Great, thank you. On a related note, as high school juniors will be facing new graduation requirements that are competency-based next year, what additional supports do they need during this time and next year to best prepare? And why don't we start with your response, Superintendent Cordova?
Sure, great. So certainly, you know, one of the things I think may be the beginning of a silver lining about what's going on is the idea that there are different ways to think about schooling, and being able to show what you are learning and doing. And so we've begun to have conversations even right now about what high school grading looks like, what are the essential learnings that we would want kids engaging in the last 2 months of school. How do we move away from, this is the ultimate step away from seat time, obviously, right? Because kids are not in school, they're not in a seat. And we've really stressed the importance of flexibility, both for families and for teachers around our approaches to learning. And, you know, my perspective is we have as many teachers who have the same challenges with thinking about working from home as our families have. So teachers who have their own children, to Rob's point, students who are working during the day and are earning really essential dollars for their families. And so this idea of anytime learning, of really working on the big ideas of demonstrating what you have learned and understand through projects or assignments, I think will help us in some ways move forward. I think it's going to be really challenging to go back to a system that ties kids down to a classroom, a seat with you know, just the same old that we had in the past after this. And so, you know, definitely I think a silver lining is we'll have teachers who have very different ideas about what it means to engage with kids in real time, anytime learning as a result of this.
Thank you, Superintendent. I'd like to get your thoughts, Michelle. How do we support these students and really prepare them as high school graduation requirements shift for junior students and become more competency-based?
You know, I think the majority of the conversations that I've been involved in sort of echo Susana's point around a silver lining, in that we're seeing communities come together to respond to this crisis in ways that can only be of benefit to their students and their families going forward, whether it's feeding our students, making sure that they're getting appropriate, and their families, making sure they're getting appropriate health care, providing work opportunities in this really changed environment. I think the relationships that are forming will go a long way around creating more internship opportunities. Our State Department, I cannot get through this webinar without saying how incredibly supportive our State Department has been. Commissioner Anthus is on every call with every superintendent, and they're talking to districts about embracing a capstone option, which is sort of this work-based learning or individualized planning for their students. And so I really see this as an area, both an obligation and an opportunity for our local communities and districts to come together to get the kids those more meaningful or differentiated learning experiences.
Thank you, Michelle. Superintendent Stein, you just spoke about the economic struggles that so many of the families in your district are facing and how those struggles are reshaping students' perspectives and outlooks on their own post-secondary ventures. I'm curious, how are you supporting students whose families are facing so much more economic instability now than they were a month ago? What does that look like?
Well, it's a community effort. You know, we have access to really good information because we've talked to every family and every student. And so we're really drawing on community partners. We're also doing something we've never done before, which is actually we have a family services department. And we're actually allocating dollars directly through families, not our own dollars, but local funders have actually given us money to allocate to families because they know we're in a good position to understand what people need. That's a drop in the bucket, though. And again, you know, we can help kids get access to the internet or online learning. We can provide meal deliveries, but you know, there's going to have to be an economic solution to this. It's amazing how much more and more schools are burdened with, and this current crisis is a good example. But there are limits to what a school district can do to lift a family out of poverty.
Absolutely.
Can I just add?
Absolutely.
You know, after the recession in 2009, one of the things that happened, at least in Denver, is we saw many of the local nonprofits, particularly in the behavioral health space, that lost their funding, nonprofits that just went away. And even though the economy came back, we did not see the resurgence of those supports, really critical supports for families, particularly in the areas of mental health, health and well-being for our families. And so I would say even prior to this health crisis, we had an explosion of needs around mental health for our children and our families that had not yet been addressed outside of our schools or the very limited resources in our public health system. My fear is that given this crisis now, even the few nonprofits that have been able to sort of reestablish some roots are going to find themselves in the exact same space that we were in 2009-10, where many of those nonprofits no longer have the funding that they need to be able to continue to serve families. And what was already a very demanding need, particularly around mental health, I fear will really, really explode. And right now, some of that may be somewhat hidden because people are mostly at home, but those needs are not gone. And I think we're going to see a real resurgence of extreme needs for our children and families as we come out of this.
You raised a very interesting point, Superintendent Cordova, that we came into this crisis with just an explosion, as you said, of mental health needs among students already. Now we have this health crisis, which will likely exacerbate those mental health needs. And yet we're gonna have a lack of resources available for these students. So what role does a school district play in trying to accommodate those mental health needs of its students, especially at a time like this?
Yeah, so we definitely, like all of our mental health providers, are still working with our students. We have first line of support information about how to get in touch with our social workers. We're doing welfare checks on families and students who are high needs. I know one of our schools had a really terrific plan where every student was being contacted at least twice a week, but high needs kids were being contacted daily, and particularly by their mental health teams. And so we do have approaches to make sure that we've got supports in place. But we were barely able and not able really to keep up with the mental health needs of our kids when we were in school. I fear that after this, it's just going to be that much more extreme.
Thank you, Superintendent Cordova. What does that kind of portrait look like in rural schools, Michelle? Are you seeing an explosion of mental health needs since this health crisis began? And how are school districts stepping up to serve students with their mental health challenges right now?
Well, I again, ditto to Susana about the state of affairs going into the crisis in terms of increasing needs and a complete lack of resources to respond. You know, when Denver's got a shortage of staff, the rural communities are, you know, tenfold. We're at crisis point and have been for quite some time there. I'm not sure we know yet what the extent of the increasing needs is going to look like when we get back. We're not even sure when we're going to get back, right? But what I know what folks are doing now, very similar to DPS, is wellness checks, making sure that folks are reaching out to their neediest, their identified students or at-risk students. And also, I thought interesting, they're giving their teachers resources so that when they're zooming in, for lack of a better way of saying it, they know what to look for. And if a kid is, they know that if a kid hasn't shown up 1, 2, 3 days in a row, check in with those parents, even if it's not a student who would typically be at risk. And, you know, what's going on in the background, those sort of things to try and identify the kids at risk. The problem becomes we don't always have some place to refer them to in our rural communities. And a lot of ongoing conversations prior to and go at now and after. What is the responsibility of the school and how do we partner? We're not mental health experts for the most part, but it's critically important partnerships with our communities to make sure we're providing services on site, or at least at a minimum within our communities so that our families don't have to drive 30, 40, 60 miles to get to a counselor.
Thank you, Michelle. We're going to move right now to audience questions. I believe we have a flurry of questions coming in. Again, if you have a question you would like to submit for one or all of our panelists, please click on the Q&A icon, which should be located toward the bottom of your screen, and you can submit your question there and we will be able to access it. First audience question, how are the superintendents preparing to address evaluating students as they enter their next school year, and how will districts get them where they need to be? What does remediation look like? This came from Mark Sass. Do you want to weigh in, Superintendent Cordova or Superintendent Stein?
Sure, I'll take a stab. And I saw a related question around, I think from Ulka, around should we be thinking about just holding all kids back a year? So I think it's really important that we're thinking about not penalizing kids through concepts like holding them back, but I do think that next year needs to look significantly different. I think it does need to look like we're doing a lot more work around competency-based instruction so that we can take kids where they are and try to accelerate their learning as much as possible. I think we're going to need to think about how we can rethink what traditional schooling looks like given this interruption. You know, I have been sort of joking that, you know, maybe we don't need to have snow days anymore now that we are embracing the whole idea of remote learning. Maybe there are other ways to keep kids learning. You know, we don't have a plan right now to recollect the technology that we have. And so maybe we can think about what are some ways that we can keep kids connected over the summer, even if it is remote, regardless of what happens, so that we can help kids stay learning all the time. We are going to need to be doing a lot more diagnostic assessments of students, and then really focusing on acceleration. I think that's really where we're trying to put the focus of our energy, and acceleration through, if possible, things like small group tutorials, summer learning, after school time, all things that are going to require additional funding in a landscape where we're all likely facing pretty significant budget cuts.
Thank you, Superintendent Cordova. I think you just broke 92,000 hearts with your comment on snow days there. We'll turn to you, Superintendent Stein. What does your district plan to do in addressing evaluations for students as they enter their next year? And how do you plan to get your students to where they need to be?
I first have to just respond to the snow day comment, Susana. I think snow days are to superintendents what snow removal is to mayors. There's no quicker way to lose your job than make a bad decision on a snow day. So I'm definitely not going to equate snow days with the current crisis we're in. But back to your question, Erica, it's a little hard for us to say what we're going to be doing in the fall, because I think we're all struggling to keep a pace of events. And so to say what we're planning for September is a little premature. However, what we're thinking is that this is a real opportunity to think differently about differentiation. Because I totally agree with Susana. It's just impractical and it's punitive to say we're going to somehow use some massive grouping strategy, hold every kid back a grade or something like that as a way to help them catch up. Unfortunately, I don't think that we have enough confidence in our state assessments to think that they would have been valuable as measures of student learning through this event, so we call them off. But we're going to need some assessment of student population learning so that we know what learning has been lost. It's going to be significant. And then we're going to need not just grouping strategies, but classroom by classroom instructional strategies to catch kids up. If that's a benefit that comes from this crisis, that we start differentiating more and targeting learning goals for individual student needs, that will be a huge benefit that comes out of this crisis.
Thank you very much. Superintendent Cordova cited Olga's question, and I'm going to go ahead and read the full question. I believe this will be for any panelists to weigh in on. Olga says, many states have put a hold on things like testing and accountability, which some people would argue have kept us tied to a more conventional way of doing school. How would you suggest educators and leaders use this opening to transform what learning and education look like in ways that are more student-driven, competency-based, project-based, etc.? Anyone have any particularly strong feelings on that question?
I'll just make the point that I think distance learning requires that we think differently about how we use time, right? That we are not going to have an elementary school student sitting in front of Zoom doing classes in sequence for 7 hours a day, and we shouldn't want that. But what we should be thinking about is how do we help students learn to work independently in a different way than they have. But that requires real teaching of skills. I mean, Rob knows this from his expeditionary learning experience. You have to actually teach students how to set goals, how to structure their time on their own, when to ask questions, how to use the feedback they get to improve their performance. So this is an opportunity, I think, to think about structuring instruction where you might have a small mini lesson that could be delivered in a Zoom context or a Microsoft Teams context, or it could be asynchronous and students watch something and then they do work independently and then they get feedback from their instructors. But that is a very different rhythm to instruction than maybe students have experienced, and that will require, I think, professional development for teachers. It will require the right quality materials being provided by districts to help teachers to navigate that. But we'll still need to know our kids making progress. And so we shouldn't lose sight of the role that assessments play in informing instruction. We'll need to know where kids are when we get back to school to figure out what supports they need. And that's always going to be the case, but we can be creative about how we deliver that.
Thank you, Dr. King. Our next question comes from Peter Sherman, and I'd like to punt this to Michelle because I'm curious about how this will play out in rural schools or how you see it playing out in rural schools. Peter asks, what are the implications for district functions if students must stay at home in the fall, or in the case that in-person schooling fluctuates between being open and closed multiple times? How might our efforts to serve students need to evolve even further than what we are doing now?
You know, I stutter a little bit because we had a call with the commissioner this morning and talking about maybe not what's going to happen in the fall and what that might not look like. I have the majority of my members who still think they're going to hoping to bring kids back in at the end of May or June in some sort of staggered way, just to sort of get that face-to-face connection again, maybe give some parents relief and really connect. So I think that and again, echoing our teachers are our true heroes here and our administrators and the way that they've completely pivoted their learning environment. But as the commissioner said this morning, if we are to do this for an extended period of time, we're going to have to get some more systems and structures in place, both to meet the needs. Right now, you know, it's almost day to day how we're learning how to meet the needs of our special education population, our ELL language learners, and literally day to day. And stress management, both parents and teachers, and really, I hope, on the ground working together in unprecedented ways rather than coming at each other with fingers pointed. So we are, and our educators across the board are very interested, to go back to the prior question around how do we redefine education and what does that look like, whether we're back in school or not, or some iteration of that. Right now, I think we're focused on meeting immediate needs, and we're still too much in the stress of the crisis to really look that forward. But I am at risk of sounding sort of too optimistic. After what I've seen of our educators' response, large and small, I am fully confident that we will come together and meet the needs of all of our kids and our communities going forward, and look forward to it to an extent once we get out of the chaos.
Thank you, Michelle. I'd like to hear from you, Superintendent Cordova. Is DPS considering the possibility of students staying home in the fall, or the idea that in-person instruction may fluctuate? And if so, how are you preparing for that kind of prospect?
Yeah, I want to echo a little bit of what Rob said earlier. We definitely are beginning to pivot out of the first phase, which was like launch remote learning well, feed kids, get kids tech, get teachers online. That's been an all hands on deck sort of process. We're now beginning to shift into sort of phase 2, which is end the year strong. How do we think about graduations? How do we think about marking important ceremonies if they have to be remotely? What do we think about the summer if it's remote? I think the next phase that we haven't yet gotten to is, what does starting the school year right look like for next year? You know, day by day as we hear more, you know, it certainly is in my mind that it's a very strong possibility that we may need to be in a place where remote learning is part of what happens in the fall. And even if that's intermittent, that may be the reality of what we're dealing with. I think it does mean that we need to think really thoughtfully about how we support our teachers and our school leaders. And one of the questions that I saw either in the chat or in the questions was, you know, how do we support people to learn in this new environment and to experiment? And, you know, one of the recommendations, I think, is to seek order but not control, because control will quash innovation. And so how do we set up some guardrails? How do we set up, you know, an orderly way to do this, but how do we allow for real innovation to help us improve what is very new circumstances for the vast majority of our educators?
Thank you, Superintendent Cordova. We have another audience question that addresses the mental health needs of educators. We spoke briefly about the mental health needs of students, but I think this is a great question. Amy Baca-Oler, also president of CEA, asks, how are districts addressing the mental health needs of educators right now? We are seeing the mental health needs of educators elevated right now, just as we are seeing increased mental health issues for students.
Yeah, I just want to firmly agree with that. You know, teachers are struggling right now, and I want to echo what both Susana and Michelle said. They really are the heroes here. One of the challenges that we knew would happen with this pivot to online learning is that teachers, like the rest of us, have children at home. They have other responsibilities they're juggling. It's one of the reasons that we decided that our learning would be asynchronous, because how do you expect the teacher with 2 or 3 kids in their lap to be teaching in a synchronous environment that's structured as if it were a regular school day? So teachers are under enormous pressure, and there's a shortage of mental health resources. There's a shortage of health resources that is affecting teacher households just like everybody else. I don't think they're really unique in that regard, except that there's an enormous burden right now. And I think there's a psychic burden that teachers are bearing because they feel so responsible for children.
Absolutely. Michelle, do you have any sense of how other rural school districts in Colorado are addressing the mental health needs of educators specifically in this crisis?
Yeah, we had that conversation last Friday on one of our roundtables on this issue, and I think some of them were like, that's something we really need to pay more attention to. And others, because teachers take on everything in the world, personally and professionally. They care so much about these kids, and they don't always raise their hand that they need help. So I think that was a good highlight. And there are most folks, I think, are bringing their teachers together at least weekly and having conversations and trying to do some norming and storming around what they're stressing about, and trying to say to them, districts are taking completely different approaches around how structures that I said earlier, but really saying, do what you can. And if parents are coming at you, send them our way and we'll help, because parents are stressed too. So really just trying to identify the pockets of stress and then providing the support and minimize. I think teachers put more on themselves because of who they are and what drives them to the profession. And that's a compliment, but also can be to their detriment.
Thank you, Michelle.
Erica,
Yes, go ahead.
if I could, I'd just love to give a huge shout out to Tiffany Choi, who's the president of the Denver Classroom Teachers Association. She and I have been working very, very closely during this time. And one of the things that I'm definitely seeing is that when teachers are most stressed, it's either they're stressed because the fear that they're not doing something right, and lots of our educators are feeling sort of this pressure, particularly around things like working with students with disabilities and IEPs, and some of their beliefs, sometimes accurate, sometimes not accurate, around it. And so being able to problem solve those on a case-by-case basis. And then teachers who are really feeling stressed also because they have rigid expectations from a school leader that we need to problem solve. And part of what has been really helpful about my collaboration with Tiffany has just been the opportunity to, on a case-by-case basis, solve things for people. And I believe deeply that our teachers care and want to do the right thing for our students, that our school leaders have the highest of expectations for their kids and want to support them. And anything that we can do to help open up lines of communication around that will help lower some of the stress that our teachers have. Now, obviously, we've got other teachers who are dealing with illness in their family, their own personal illness, things like that. And we want to just make sure that we're supporting them as much as we can.
Muted.
I'm so sorry. Thank you, Superintendent Cordova. I'm also hoping you can chime in here, Dr. King. How are you seeing school districts across the country really address the mental health needs of educators in this moment of crisis?
I think Michelle's point is right. It's quite variable across school districts. Some school districts, I think, have been very intentional about creating supports for their teachers and supports through this whole process, whether it's supports around the shift to distance learning or supporting students with IEPs or dealing with their own stress and challenges like balancing childcare and work, as Rob was describing. And other districts haven't been very attentive to that. And one of the things that we worry a lot about at the Education Trust is these disparities between districts. And sometimes it comes down to district capacity. We have districts that were significantly under-resourced before this crisis that were struggling to fulfill their core functions. And now that's all been exacerbated by this crisis. So we're in a situation where the kids and teachers who need the most got the least before the crisis and are getting even less now.
Yeah.
And I think our collective challenge as a country is to think about how do we come out of this moment? Do we come out of this moment saying, because of a financial crisis, we have to do less and lower our aspirations and expectations? Do we resort to blaming each other, or do we alternatively say, this is a moment where we turn toward each other rather than on each other, and we make a real investment in strengthening our safety net and investing in education, because that is the long-term answer to economic opportunity? Do we rethink how we distribute the benefits of our economic system in ways that make it less likely that people have to choose between going to work sick and being able to stay home and take care of themselves? So this is a crossroads moment, I think, for the country, not just around education, but around broader questions of how our society is organized.
Yeah, a crossroads moment, very well said there. Well, with that, we are running very low on time. I'd like to thank all of our audience members who submitted questions. We will go ahead and compile those and send those along to our panelists. In our last few minutes here, I'm hoping that each one of our panelists can just offer us their final thoughts on schooling in the era of COVID-19. What are your big takeaways in this moment? And whoever would like to start, I'll throw that out there.
I'll go ahead and start. I think that this has just been a demonstration of the importance of what it means to come together as a community. I can't say enough. I've had school leaders who, while we were on extended break, came to their schools to help make sure that meals were getting out to kids. Teachers who have been contacting, I had a teacher advisory council Zoom meeting a couple of nights ago, and one of the teachers had to get off at 6 p.m. because that's when he was doing office hours for his kids who work during the day. So just incredible efforts on the part of educators to stay connected with their kids, and a real need to make sure that the most vulnerable kids don't fall through the cracks during this time. So just really want to thank all of our educators who are putting in so much energy to.
Thank you, Superintendent. Anyone else have any closing thoughts they'd like to share?
Yeah, I'll share two. One is on the pessimistic side. The research on online learning is not very extensive, but what is available says that it's not very good. And so that's the bad news, is there's going to be a lot of lost learning. And I don't think that the media or policymakers are paying enough attention to the actual efficacy of online learning. It's just sort of everybody get online and keep on learning as usual. Many of the comments have reflected that it's a different kind of learning, and it's going to need a lot of development. And in that space, while we're figuring it out, whether this is short or long term, we need to not be punitive, whether that's holding kids or teachers harmless as they experiment. Everybody's doing their best, but at the end of the day, there's going to be a lot of lost learning. On the positive side, I've never seen a bigger stride forward for collaboration, whether it's our state leadership and our community leadership coming together, or whether it's teachers jointly lesson planning, because they are really collaborating to figure this out, and they know that they can do it better together. So if there's one hope that we emerge from this thing, it's as a more collaborative system, providing education for our kids.
Yeah, I would echo that and steal some words from a rural superintendent on a call earlier today, that I think we're seeing what our schools and our communities and our teachers, when they all come together, what we can do. And I hope that we see a renewed appreciation for teachers and schools generally, and a renewed respect, and that we continue this, we continue to listen to each other and not make let's do this, we have to do this. But we've got to, every community is different. All our needs are different. We're going to be in a fiscal crisis for quite some time. So let's just continue that collaboration that came out of the crisis. Maybe be a little kinder, a little gentler, and go forward and do what's best for our kids.
Thank you, Michelle. And Dr. King, do you have any last words to share with us?
Yeah, I share everyone's thoughts of being grateful to teachers and parents and principals and superintendents who are leading in this challenging moment. The one thing I would implore folks to think about is just the centrality of relationships and connectedness to school. I was a kid who, I lost both my parents when I was a kid. Home was really hard. The one place that I had structure and support and positive relationships and a sense of safety was school. It would have been incredibly hard for me as a kid to be away from school for months. So I just think that, you know, having that morning meeting, that time where kids get to check in with their teacher and their peers, having that daily contact that Rob talked about with at least one adult from the school district, so I know as a kid that I'm seen and that someone's paying attention to me, that is just hugely important. And we have to ensure that we don't lose kids in this period. And the way we do that is to emphasize connection and relationship as the primary focus of our energy.
Thank you, Dr. I think that's a really powerful note to end this webinar on, the fact that schools play such a central role in kids' lives and really reinforce their stability day to day. And with that, we have concluded our webinar. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for taking time and giving us such an open, honest conversation about schooling in the era of COVID-19 today. I'd also like to thank all of our attendees for making time to join us. And a special thank you goes out to A+ Colorado and Education Reform Now, two organizations working to improve public education. If you would like to rewatch this webinar, you can catch a recording on apluscolorado.org. Thank you, everybody, and stay safe.
Thank you, Erica. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.